Welcome back to the Centre for Christian Spirituality, to our reflections on the Gospels of the Sunday. And today we're reflecting on the Gospel of the 17th Sunday in Ordinary Time. We might notice that we have been reflecting on the Gospels of Mark, but the Church now takes up two readings this week and next week from the Gospel of John. After Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias, a large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountains by himself. Last week's Gospel saw Mark coming right up to the presentation of the multiplication of the loaves, but the Church changes and gives us John's version of the multiplication rather than Mark. And it's a bit different in the sense that this is the beginning of a long discourse in which Jesus is presented as the bread of life. So that this incident is now followed, and will be followed in the following Sundays, by a continuation of the theme. Notice that the people see him as a prophet. Moses was the first prophet who interceded and God gave them manna. Elisha also was somebody who multiplied bread in the Old Testament. So the multiplication of the loaves is the recognition of Jesus as a prophet, one who had come from God and was doing the things that God had actually done in the past. That just as God fed his people in the past, Jesus feeds the people now. And there are definite Eucharistic references there that Jesus took and blessed and gave. He doesn't break, as the other disciples, the other Gospels suggest, but nevertheless the Eucharistic words are there, so that Jesus is continuing to feed the people in our own time with the celebration of the Eucharist, as he was doing to the people of his own time. The last sentence gives the response of the people, which we don't have in the synoptic stories. They wanted to come and make him king. And I think that's significant because in Luke and Matthew, the 3 temptations of Jesus in the desert, the first was to be an economic Messiah, to give them bread, or to jump from the top of the temple and be a power person, or the temple, he was offered the kingdom of all the world. And so that was one of the temptations, really, to move away from being that suffering Messiah that the Father had asked him to be. And that, in a sense, is saying that the people haven't understood. That just as the people of Nazareth saw him with natural eyes, these people are seeing him in terms of their own expectations of a king that will free them from the Romans. So it's an incident that's full of meaning, and I think that meaning is going to be drawn out in next Sunday and the Sunday after. Yeah.
I've got a strange take on this one because I've been doing some work with some teachers on the wedding feast at Cana, which is very John, and in a similar vein, there's a problem there, they don't have enough wine. In this one, what struck me is, there's 5,000 people, the problem is we don't have enough food. Somehow, in a similar way, Jesus, I think I added up this morning, there was 180 gallons of wine left over, more than anyone could ever use. Similarly here, after feeding 5,000 people, there was 12 baskets left over. Yes. So I'm not quite sure what the significance is, but what strikes me is this extraordinary abundance of Jesus in the presence of the people presented with the problem. And it's as though he's up to chapter 6 here, he's gathering force, First up, there was no wine for a small wedding. Now he can manage 5,000 on a hill.
And that's John's style, that sort of dialogue about the issue, and then it unfolds there. Yeah. And Jesus is the one who does this. It's Jesus that gives it out here, not the disciples, as it is in the synoptics.
Just two very brief things come to mind for me. One is that television ad about from little things, big things grow. That from, what might seem to be small and insignificant, much can happen as a consequence. The other was something that I was reading that just got me puzzled in a way, that thinking is, if we don't know how to give or to share when all we know is to buy.
Yes.
And it just was another way of putting it seemed to me, and challenged me that sometimes we've got to step back from this in order to see what we do have and how so much can be done with what we do have.
And I think that's quite deliberate in John. I think Jesus is raising the question on a human level, but he's then going to go on to give it a spiritual meaning, just as he did with the woman in the well. We talked about water, and suddenly we're talking about the water that gives life. So I think that's a really Johannine theme that you've struck on there. We invite you now to just look at the text and see what you draw out of the text from just reading it yourself. Welcome back, and we invite you now to listen to the reading again.
After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up to the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up, he saw a great crowd coming toward him. Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to eat a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" And Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so that they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. And when the people saw the signs that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself.
I singled out the Eucharistic element there, that really, as will unfold as we go on in that Bread of Life discourse, really we are drawn into the sacrifice of Jesus that we actually have in the Eucharist. It's interesting that event took place at the Passover time, which was remembering the first sacrifice that brought about a covenant. And I think in the Eucharist we have that second sacrifice, and that what Jesus is allowing us to do in the Eucharist is to be fed not just with ordinary bread, but with the bread that comes down from heaven. So I felt that I might just reflect on that in relationship to the Eucharist during the week.
What struck me, and I'm not quite sure why, was about the generosity of this. Am I generous? Am I willing to believe in that miraculous element, or am I a little cynical and tight with what I have? So I think it's calling me to just how generous am I?
I think my thought is not unlike that, Virginia. Saying before about if all I know is about buying, how can I really do something in terms of the giving? And I guess I've got to ask myself that question because at times I feel I step back and say no when I could easily say yes if I had a certain faith in myself and what I have, that even though it might seem insignificant, it might just add a richness to someone else.
Okay, thank you for that. We invite you now to draw something practical from the text, just something that you might mull over in your own life during the coming week that might help you to grow in your relationship with the Lord. We ask you now to turn to the Lord and ask the Lord to give you the grace that we need when we try to do something like this. St. Paul says, Jesus says, without me you can do nothing, and Paul says, I can do all things in him who strengthens me. So as well as making decisions, we need to call on the Lord to enable us to bring them to fruition. Thank you for being with us. We hope you might join us again as we reflect on the 18th Sunday of Ordinary Year next week, where we conclude now by listening to the prayer from the Liturgy of the 17th Sunday.
O God, protector of those who hope in you, without whom nothing has firm foundation, nothing is holy, bestow in abundance your mercy upon us, and grant that with you as our ruler and guide, we may use the good things that pass in such a way as to hold fast even now to those that endure forever through Christ our Lord.